Hey everyone, David Chen here. Let's talk about Hamilton, which just hit Disney+. Based on Ron Chernow's biography of the founding father, the musical Hamilton tells the story of how Alexander Hamilton rose from humble means to become one of the key figures in our nation's history. Overall, Hamilton remains a work of incredible power. The story is set at the birth of our nation, the stakes are high both for our country and the rest of the world. But above all else, Hamilton is a musical, and it is stirring, and it is inspiring, and it is powerful and moving and heartbreaking at times. All the musical numbers are performed with verve and intensity and beauty and skill, and all of that comes across in the Disney Plus presentation. Let's talk briefly about that Disney Plus presentation, actually. One of the things I loved most about the musical was its production design. It was simple, yet elegant. By using a series of rotating circular platforms, the show was able to use physical movement and proximity to the audience to convey the concept of things like depth of field. Basically, if you saw the show in person, it felt very cinematic, even though it was a stage show. The Disney Plus version was shot using 9 cameras, and in 13 of the songs, additional takes were done so that they could film close-up, steady cam, and other shots that would have obstructed the view for the audience. So the cinematic techniques that the stage show was arguably trying to mimic can now actually be witnessed for real in a recorded program. And the camera can direct your attention to focus on one thing definitively. You can have a little bit of shallow depth of field, something in the foreground, something in the background. The result is very immersive and at times arguably better than seeing the show live. For one thing, you get to actually see people's expressions. You can almost feel Jonathan Groff's spittle when he's performing those King George numbers, which, side note, by the way, pretty fascinating to kind of think of the parallels between that version of King George and other certain world leaders who might be extremely deranged, spit a lot when they talk, and demand complete loyalty from their subjects. Just putting that out there. On the other hand, in the Disney Plus version of Hamilton, there are a lot of cuts. So many cuts that sometimes it makes it difficult to appreciate the intricate choreography of the show, which is directed by Thomas Kail. At the end of the day, the Disney Plus version of the show retains the musical's breathtaking power. It is a reasonable approximation of the live performance, but that's all it can be, an approximation. Musical theater is by nature ephemeral, and there's something very magical about going to a live show and seeing a version of that show that no one else is ever going to see again. And what the Disney Plus version tries to do is it tries to bottle up that magic and present it to you in a format that you can stream at home. And while it can't replicate the live experience of seeing a show in a stuffy theater with thousands of people surrounding you, it's close enough. While I was watching, the thought did occur to me and many others that, like, hey, this is such a great way of watching a Broadway musical. I would love to see something like a Book of Mormon or a Lion King in this format, because many of us either can't afford to go to musicals, or we don't have time to commit to like getting out into the city and sitting through the intermission and waiting in line for the bathroom and all that stuff like that. And so I would love it if Hamilton on Disney Plus was kind of a tipping point for more musicals to be filmed in this way and made available on streaming platforms or to be sold. We've learned recently that a lot of these live musicals have been filmed in some way, and I've seen a lot of people online say things like, put them all online. And while I also want to see other filmed versions of live musicals, I do want to direct you to this thread by Mark Harris on Twitter, who knows a thing or two about live shows. And he says here, filming a musical the way Hamilton was shot is not cheap. Most Broadway shows never break even, some just make their money back, and many of the best are produced by nonprofits that don't have bottomless coffers. So who pays is a question that needs answering, and remember, everybody needs and deserves to be paid. I know some of you are saying, but can't they just? No, they can't. There are unions and there are copyrights, both of which are very good things. This is how people make their living. All that said, if after Hamilton you're hungry for more theater performance on film, I recommend checking out Broadway HD and NT Live at Home, and happy hunting. So just some thoughts about what we might see in the future, but Broadway HD and NT Live at Home are available right now if Hamilton on Disney Plus has kind of whet your appetite for more musical theater on your TV. So now that I'm done talking about the presentation, let's talk about the musical itself. What are the lessons of Hamilton? What does this musical have to say? And how might those lessons have changed, or how might our view of them have changed in the 4 years since the stage show was first recorded before it was put on Disney Plus? Before I continue, I do just want to say there's going to be spoilers for the Hamilton musical, as well as for real-life American history. So if you don't want to know what happens to Alexander Hamilton, go watch the musical, come back, then watch this video. But if you want to prepare yourself emotionally, it doesn't end super well for Hamilton. Before I continue, I also want to say, of course, that these are the lessons I took away from Hamilton. These are the things that stuck out to me most in my most recent viewing. I would love to hear what you took away from the musical. What did you think the lessons of the musical were? And feel free to share those with me in the comments. Number 1, it matters who tells your story. Obviously, one of the boldest decisions the musical makes is that there are black people and brown people and Asian people in pretty much all the leading roles. People can have their own different interpretations of what the purpose of this casting is, but I think it's about who gets to control the narrative. The show itself is obsessed with legacy. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story.
And in America, the story has largely been told by white people, and I think the show invites you to consider how that might have changed our perception of the Founding Fathers and the story of our country's founding. Now, one thing to consider is that Hamilton is telling a version of the myth of the American founding, and that myth does exclude a lot of people. There are no native characters of note in the show, nor are there any slaves. The character of Alexander Hamilton is kind of made out to be an abolitionist in the musical, but in reality, he was far from the forefront of the abolitionist movement. Lin-Manuel Miranda is of course aware of all this, he's pretty smart, and he has acknowledged that every one of these figures was complicit in the US system of slavery. We of course right now are living in a time where people are talking about removing many monuments to slave-owning founding fathers because their legacies are much more complicated than we've been led to believe. And I think it's reasonable for people to want to revise that history right now, to want to go back, reassess all the stuff we've been told, the lies we've been told, the half-truths we've been told, the omissions that have occurred, and to kind of reconsider what our history should look like. What are the things we should talk about? That's one of the most fascinating things about Hamilton the musical. It allows Black people, brown people, and Asian people to imagine what would it be like if people of color got to tell the story. While Hamilton respects musical conventions, it also infuses hip-hop, pop, and R&B into its musical style. It openly declares that the people who tell the story shape it, and it invites you to make your own entry into the history books, to not throw away your shot. While I was watching Hamilton, I was reminded of this episode of The West Wing, Season 1, Episode 18, 6 Meetings Before Lunch, where one of the characters, Jeff Breckenridge, who's a scholar, tells Josh Lyman, the deputy chief of staff, to look at the back of a dollar bill and look at the seal, the pyramid. And he says, quote, "It's unfinished, with the eye of God looking over it, and the words annuit coeptis, he, God, favors our undertaking. The seal is meant to be unfinished because this country is meant to be unfinished. We're meant to keep doing better. We're meant to keep discussing and debating. And we're meant to read books by great historical scholars and then talk about them," end quote. Ultimately, two things can be true at the same time. You can celebrate the fact that Hamilton is a brilliant piece of art that gave countless opportunities to many of its cast members and that produced immeasurable cultural impact. And you can also believe that the story it tells feels a little bit out of date, a little bit simplistic, given the reckoning that America is going through right now. Number 2, progress is only possible with great sacrifice. The show opens by posing a conflict between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. On one side is Hamilton, who's bursting with talent and with ideas and with ideals. On the other side is Burr, whose whole mantra is talk less, smile more, keep your head down, don't upset anyone, don't ruffle any feathers, just let things be, let the system be. Wait and see who the winners are before you choose a side. Throughout the play, Burr is criticized for not having any principles at all. And for all of his flaws, Alexander Hamilton does have principles. He does have things that he fights for, and he sticks his neck out there. He puts everything on the line in order to fight for what he believes. And in the end, was rewarded in some ways for it. He was rewarded by being remembered very honorably. And I think as I'm watching the show on Disney Plus during the pandemic, during police brutality protests that are roiling the country right now, the thing that sticks out to me about what Hamilton is trying to say is consider where we are in the country's history. Consider the opportunities there are to change things, and consider that you might have to sacrifice a great deal in order to be the change that you want to see in the world. Also consider that history is generally not made by people who are timid about these things. Or if it is made, it's made in a bad way, as it was with Aaron Burr. And that is ultimately one of the legacies of this musical, I think, is to stir people to action, to stir people to remember the ideals that America was founded on, to stir people to get out into the streets and to fight for what you believe in, because that is what Alexander Hamilton did. And also, side note, Hamilton the musical very much frames Alexander Hamilton as an immigrant. And you can object to that framing if you want, but what the show is trying to say is that immigrants are part of what make this country great.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Immigrants with their own ideas about what America is and can be are part of what makes this country what it is. It's part of what is beautiful about this place, and we shouldn't dismiss that. So I think that really, that to me is one of the big things that stuck out to me as I was watching the musical is think about where we are in history right now, what can be done, what needs to be done, and how you, as the viewer sitting there watching this on Disney Plus, how you might fit into that. Number 3, people aren't just one thing. They're complicated. Everyone you hate, every villain in history, Every single one of them has had someone love them. Maybe they love them in return. Every one of them has a story, but they don't necessarily get to tell the story. We see that Alexander Hamilton was a man that fought for these great ideals, but he was also at times kind of an asshole. I mean, the dude cheated on his wife and then torched his whole life just to make himself look better, according to the musical at least. And it does make his legacy pretty complicated. In one of the musical's most spectacular numbers, Satisfied, performed by Renee Elise Goldsberry, we witness Hamilton meeting his wife, and then we rewind to see that story told from a different perspective. It is mind-blowing the way it happens in the musical and in the live show, and it's just, I had never seen anything like it before in a live stage show. I was so impressed by it, and of course, Renee Elise Goldsberry knocks that number out of the park. But it also goes to showing you that, like, hey, the perspective that you had, that story might be viewed completely differently by someone else who was in the same room at the time. And finally, we learn about Aaron Burr, the guy who comes across as a craven opportunist, but he also has a child. We learn about his feelings for her, that when he was dueling with Hamilton, he didn't want her to be an orphan. We see that when Aaron Burr shoots Hamilton, he becomes the villain not only to those around him, but in our own history and in the very musical that we're watching. Side note, by the way, in my humble opinion, Leslie Odom Jr. is the star of the show. His performances in songs like Wait For It and The Room Where It Happens are just spectacular, so full of energy. Even the opening song, Alexander Hamilton, is great. I mean, this guy ties the whole thing together. He's the first voice we hear. He's almost the last voice we hear. He is just amazing, and it's really obvious to see why he became a star after this thing. But anyway, going back to lesson 3, in reality, people are complicated. People are complex. People have more sides to them than you know. And I think this musical invites you to consider what those sides are. And I think that's a message that's really important in this time right now when I see a lot of online pile-ons of people and people mobbing on to people who do stupid things online and say stupid things online. And I'm not saying necessarily that you should refrain from criticizing anyone who does something dumb or dangerous online, but I do think that it's always useful to be skeptical of the message we're told by other people, by media, to want to probe more, to want to go into the second level and kind of double click and see exactly what is happening here, and to remember that people are complex creatures. They're not only one thing. All right, those are my thoughts on Hamilton the Musical on Disney+. What were your thoughts on Hamilton on Disney+? Let me know in the comments. What were your lessons that you took away? What did you think of the presentation? If you like this video, I post lots of videos like this where I comment on works of popular culture. Please hit like or subscribe, but most importantly, hit that bell icon. It's the only way you will know when I'm posting new videos. All right, thanks for watching. I put a lot of links in the description if you want to read up on more interesting opinions on Hamilton. See you in the next one.